I didn't wake up that morning thinking about killing anyone. I woke up thinking about the cold, the kind that settles in your bones before you even open your eyes. The cabin was quiet. Esther was breathing beside me. Ruth was asleep on her pallet near the wall. For a few seconds, that was all there was. Breath, wood, cold air. Then the day started. I pulled on my clothes and stepped outside with the others, walking toward the big house like we always did, heads down, feet careful on the ice. I had done that walk thousands of times. That morning felt no different. That's the part people don't understand later. It didn't feel like the beginning of anything. It felt like another day. I was 30 years old. I had been Solomon Gray since I was 7. Since the day they stood me naked on an auction block in Richmond and looked inside my mouth like I was an animal. Master Gray bought me that day, gave me his name. I carried it because I had no choice. I worked the fields until I was 15. After that, Mrs. Gray brought me into the big house. She said it was kindness. I knew better. It just meant I could hear more. I could see more. I could learn how people talked when they believed you were not listening. That morning I was serving breakfast, coffee, eggs, bread, the usual. I stood near the wall when Thomas Gray came in. He was already smiling. I noticed that. His smile always meant trouble. He carried a newspaper like it mattered. He dropped it next to his father's plate and said he had a solution. That word stayed with me. Solution. As if we were a problem on paper. As if bodies could be solved. I kept my eyes down. I poured coffee. Thomas talked. A beer in New Orleans. Premium prices. Young stock. He said it easily. Like he had practiced. He talked about women. Laundry girls. Then he said my wife's name. Esther. He said it like it was nothing. Like he was talking about a horse. Then he said my daughter's name. Ruth. 5 years old. He said she would be worth more later, but better to sell now. I remember my hand tightening around the coffee pot. I remember thinking I should feel something dramatic, rage, shock. I didn't. I felt empty. Master Gray took the list. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He said it was reasonable. He said after Christmas. Those words hit harder than the rest. After Christmas. 3 weeks. That was it. 3 weeks before they took my wife and child south. I finished serving breakfast. I did my job. I cleared the table. I walked out of the room. No one noticed anything. They never did. That's the danger of being invisible for too long. People forget you are there until it's too late. That night in the cabin, I didn't tell Esther. I told myself it was mercy. The truth is I didn't know how to say it. There are some things that don't fit into words cleanly. I lay beside her. Ruth breathed softly. I stared at the ceiling and counted time. 3 weeks. I thought about my mother. I always did when something went wrong. They sold her when I was 10. 4 men held me while she screamed. I never knew where she went until years later when I found her name in Master Gray's records. South Carolina. $800. Seeing it written down didn't give me peace. It just made it final. That night, I understood something clearly. They were going to do it again. They were going to take my family the same way. And no one was going to stop them. I told Esther 5 days later. She was sewing Ruth's dress. I said the words plainly. They are selling you. You and Ruth. After Christmas. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She went very still. Then she said no. Then she said not Ruth. Then she said we should run. I shook my head. We both knew better. Patrols, dogs, winter, a child. Running wasn't hope. It was a shorter road to the same ending. She asked me what I was going to do. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I had a plan. Because I realized I had already decided. I told her there was another way. I didn't dress it up. I didn't make it sound noble. I told her the truth. That the house trusted me. That I heard things. That I knew where things were kept. That Christmas meant noise and confusion. She understood faster than I wanted her to. She said they would kill me. I said yes. She said they would punish everyone. I said they already were. We didn't argue. Arguing means there are choices left. There weren't. I told her about Jacob, about the stables, about horses, about timing. She asked about me. I didn't answer. She didn't press. She just held my face and told me she loved me. Not like a goodbye. Like a fact. Something solid to hold on to. The next day I spoke to Jacob. Not directly. We never spoke directly. I said Christmas would be crowded. He said crowds made cover. That was enough. Over the next weeks, I watched the house closely. I didn't feel heroic. I felt careful. I cleaned the study when Mrs. Gray ordered it. I learned where the pistols were kept. I learned how fast I could reach them. I learned which floorboards made noise. At night, I gathered plants near the creek. My mother had taught me which ones mattered. She said white men walk past power every day because they don't believe it belongs to the land. I dried the leaves. I ground them into powder. Esther watched me. She didn't ask many questions. Once she asked if it would hurt them. I said yes. I didn't add anything else. Christmas came closer. The house filled with food and candles and talk about God. On Christmas Eve, the guests arrived. I stood where I always stood, near the wall, silent, watching. I slipped into the cellar and poured the powder into the wine bottles. My hands were steady. I didn't feel fear. Fear had already done everything it could to me. When I brought the bottles upstairs, Thomas nearly ran into me. He smelled like whiskey. He told me to watch where I was going. I said yes, sir. He walked past me. I thought about my daughter. I thought about time. Dinner began. Master Gray raised his glass. He talked about blessings. He talked about labor. He didn't look at us. They drank. I watched them drink. By 8 o'clock, I could see it. Hands shaking, eyes unfocused, confusion. At 8:15, I caught Esther's eyes near the kitchen door. I nodded. That was all. She left. By 8:30, the room was falling apart. People stood and sat and didn't know why. Master Gray asked what was happening. I walked to the study. I took the pistols. When I came back, Thomas was shouting. He called me names. He told me I would hang. I shot him. I didn't feel anything special. He fell. Margaret screamed. Master Gray begged. He said he would free them. He said he would fix it. I told him it was too late. I shot him. After that, I finished it. I didn't rush. I didn't enjoy it. I did what I had come to do. When it was done, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I sat at Master Gray's desk and wrote everything down. Why I did it. What they planned to do. I signed my name. When they came, I told them I did it. I told them I was a man. They beat me. I didn't fight back. I'd already done what mattered. They hanged me 3 days later. I don't know what happened to my body after that. I only know Esther and Ruth made it north. That is the only part that matters. After I said those words to Esther, after I told her what I could and left the rest hanging between us, the cabin felt smaller. Not because anything moved, but because there was no space left for pretending. We went on with our days after that. That's something people never believe. They think once a man decides something like this, every hour becomes dramatic. It doesn't. Most hours are dull. You still wake up. You still work. You still eat when there is food. You still answer when spoken to. I carried water. I polished silver. I stood in corners. Inside, my thoughts kept circling the same few points, like an animal pacing a cage. After Christmas, New Orleans, Ruth, over and over. Sometimes I would catch myself watching my daughter too closely, memorizing how she laughed, how she frowned when she concentrated, how she leaned into Esther's side without thinking. I hated myself for that. It felt like I was already saying goodbye. Other times I felt nothing at all, just a blank stretch of time where I moved and spoke and breathed without attaching meaning to it. That scared me more than the anger. Anger feels alive. Emptiness feels like you're already halfway gone. In the big house, they talked about Christmas constantly. Food, guests, decorations. Mrs. Gray wanted everything done twice, cleaned twice, polished twice. She corrected servants over small things. The placement of forks, the shine on glass. I listened. I always listened. Not because I wanted to, because listening had kept me alive. People with power talk when they feel safe. They talk more when they're pleased with themselves. Christmas made them careless. I heard names. I heard arrival times. I heard how long they expected dinner to last. None of it sounded important on its own. Together, it formed a shape. At night, I lay beside Esther and stared into the dark. Sometimes she cried quietly. Sometimes she didn't. We didn't talk much. There was nothing new to say. Ruth slept between us more often. She had started waking from dreams. I don't know if children sense fear or if they simply feel when the ground beneath them is unsteady. One night, she asked me if Christmas meant presents. I told her yes. She smiled and went back to sleep. I turned my face away so Esther wouldn't see it break. In the days that followed, I began noticing how tired everyone was. Not just us. Even the Greys. Master Grey's hands shook slightly when he lifted his cup. Thomas drank earlier in the day now. His temper was shorter. That mattered. A drunk man is easier to predict than a sober one. I didn't think of it as strategy. I thought of it as paying attention. I had been paying attention my whole life. Mrs. Grey sent me to clean the study again because she was nervous about appearances. I moved slowly in that room. I touched nothing I didn't need to. I noted where everything sat. The desk, the drawer, the pistols, the key. I imagined my hand reaching for it. Not with excitement, with caution. I practiced the movement in my head, the way you practice a task you don't want to fail because failure means something final. When I went back to the quarters, I passed people who didn't look at me directly. Some of them knew something was wrong. Some of them always knew something was wrong, because that's how life was here. Miriam in the kitchen avoided my eyes, then met them suddenly, like she was checking to see if I was still myself. Jacob spoke even less than usual. Old Samuel hummed while he worked, the same tune over and over. No one asked questions. Questions are dangerous. On one of the colder nights, Esther asked me if I was afraid. I thought about it before answering. I told her the truth. I said I had been afraid my entire life. Afraid of the whip. Afraid of being sold. Afraid of losing people. Afraid of saying the wrong thing. Afraid of nothing changing. I told her that fear like that becomes background noise. You stop noticing it. What scared me now was how calm I felt when I thought about Christmas Eve. That quiet certainty. That scared me because it felt like the part of me that hesitated had already accepted its place. Esther nodded. She didn't tell me to stop. She didn't tell me to go on. She just listened. On the day before Christmas Eve, the plantation felt tight, like everyone was holding their breath. The guest rooms were prepared. The food was nearly ready. The house smelled of spice and meat and smoke. I walked through it carrying trays and felt like I was walking through a place that didn't belong to me, even though I knew every corner better than the people who owned it. That night, I sat with Ruth and helped her practice her letters in the dirt outside the cabin, the way my mother had done with me. She laughed when she got one wrong. I corrected her gently. I thought about how my mother's hands had guided mine. I thought about how she had told me letters mattered because words last longer than bodies. I didn't know if she was right, but I believed her. When Christmas Eve came, I woke before dawn. Esther was already awake. We didn't speak. We dressed Ruth in her clean dress. Esther braided her hair slowly. I watched their hands move together and forced myself to remember it exactly as it was. Not better, not worse, just real. At the big house, everything moved according to plan. Guests arrived. Laughter filled rooms that had heard screaming before. I took coats. I poured drinks. I walked to the cellar when told. When I opened the bottles and added the powder, I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible. That difference mattered. When Thomas bumped into me later and called me boy, nothing rose up in me. Not anger, not fear, just confirmation. He was exactly who he had always been. At dinner, I stood behind them and watched them eat and drink and praise what they were consuming. I thought about how many times I had served people who would sell a child without blinking. When the first signs appeared, I noticed them the way I noticed everything else. Quietly, hands shaking, words slurring, confusion setting in like fog. When I nodded to Esther, it wasn't dramatic. It was the smallest movement I could make. After that, everything moved faster, but not in my head. My head stayed clear. When I walked to the study, when I took the pistols, When I stepped back into the room, I didn't think about history or justice or God. I thought about time. I thought about how many seconds mattered. I thought about how if I stopped, everything before this would be for nothing. That's the truth. I didn't act because I wanted to be remembered. I acted because I could not go back to standing still. Once that line was crossed, there was no uncrossing it. After that point, after I crossed whatever line existed inside me, time stopped feeling normal. Days still passed. The sun still came up. Work still had to be done. But my sense of before and after changed. Everything became measured against Christmas Eve. How many days left? How many hours left? What still needed to be done? I didn't write lists. Writing lists felt dangerous. Lists can be found. Instead, I kept everything in my head and repeated it until it stayed. I moved through the big house like I always had, but now every movement had weight. When I carried silver, I noticed how heavy it was, how it could crack a skull if it needed to. When I opened doors, I paid attention to hinges, to the sound they made when they were rushed versus when they were eased open. These weren't thoughts I enjoyed. They were thoughts that arrived and stayed. At night, I slept lightly, not because I was afraid of being caught, but because my mind wouldn't shut down. I kept replaying moments, not to relive them, but to make sure I understood them correctly. The breakfast table, Thomas's voice, Master Gray saying reasonable. After Christmas, I tested myself sometimes, asking if there was another way I hadn't seen. If I had missed a door that could still open without blood. Every time, the answer was the same. There was no appeal left, no bargain, no mercy that didn't come with a chain attached. I had watched too many families pulled apart to believe in exceptions. The plantation had its own rhythm in those weeks. Slaves worked harder because the big house demanded more. White people grew impatient because perfection never arrives fast enough. Mrs. Gray snapped more often. She corrected us sharply, then apologized in the same breath, like she was soothing herself. Master Gray spent more time in his study. Thomas drank earlier and stayed drunk longer. I noticed the way Thomas's hands shook when he got angry, how he leaned on furniture to steady himself. I noticed which servants avoided him and which ones couldn't. Miriam in the kitchen kept her eyes on her work. She moved with care, the way women move when they have learned that being noticed can be dangerous. One afternoon, she mentioned the wine cellar without looking at me. She said Master Gray wanted the best bottles brought up for Christmas Eve. She said it would be a shame something went wrong with them. She didn't say poison. She didn't say help. She didn't say my name. That was enough. I nodded once. That was our conversation. I didn't tell her details. I didn't need to. People who have suffered learn to read small signals. With Jacob, the conversations were just as quiet. We spoke while working, never facing each other directly. He told me which horses were strongest, which ones could handle long distance without rest. I told him what time Esther and Ruth would come to the stables. 8:30. Not earlier, not later. Timing mattered. If they left too soon, it would be noticed. If they left too late, they would be caught in the middle of whatever came next. Jacob asked me once if I was sure. I said no. He nodded. That was the end of it. Certainty is a luxury. We didn't have it. All we had was decision. In the quarters, people sensed something. You can feel it when the air changes. People spoke more quietly. Some avoided me. Others watched me too closely. I didn't blame them. Being associated with trouble is dangerous when trouble usually loses. I didn't ask anyone else for help. The fewer people involved, the fewer people punished. That was the rule I kept coming back to. I couldn't protect everyone. I could only try not to destroy more lives than necessary. Esther and I spoke little, but when we did, it was practical. She asked what Ruth should wear. I told her something clean and warm. She asked what route she would take with Jacob. I told her through the pine forest, away from the main road. She asked how far the first stop would be. I told her Fredericksburg. She nodded and memorized it like a prayer. We didn't talk about me, not because we were pretending, but because there was nothing useful to say. Love doesn't need speeches when time is short. Ruth sensed something but didn't understand it. She clung to Esther more. She asked more questions. I answered the ones I could. I told her Christmas was coming. I told her there would be food and lights. I didn't tell her about after. At night, when she slept between us, I listened to her breathing and felt something tighten in my chest that I had to control. If I let myself imagine her crying in a wagon heading south, I would lose control. Control mattered. Losing control helps no one. I gathered the plants slowly, carefully, not because I was afraid of being seen, but because haste leads to mistakes. I dried them in the rafters. I ground them when Ruth was asleep. Esther watched without comment. Once, she asked if the powder would kill them. I told her no, not right away. I told her it would make them weak and confused. She nodded and said nothing more. She didn't ask why not. She understood that I needed them alive long enough to see what was happening. To understand. Understanding was part of it. I thought about religion more than usual during that time. Not because I was searching for forgiveness, but because Christianity was everywhere on that plantation. In sermons, in decorations, in how they talked about themselves as good people. I had listened to Reverend Blackwood preach obedience for years. I had watched him bless meals made by hands he would never shake. I wondered if he believed what he said or if belief was just another habit. I didn't spend much time worrying about what God would think of me. If there was a God, he had been watching all of this long before I decided to act. If there wasn't, then nothing I did would change that either. As Christmas Eve approached, my mind grew quieter, not calmer, quieter. The noise of doubt faded, not because the doubts were answered, but because they stopped mattering. When you reach a point where every option costs you everything, choosing becomes simpler. The night before Christmas Eve, Esther and I lay awake. Ruth slept between us. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. Esther whispered that she was afraid. I told her I was too. We didn't compare fears. We didn't rank them. Fear isn't a contest. She asked me again if I was sure. I told her no again. She said she loved me. I said it back. We didn't cry. Tears would have drained energy we needed. Christmas Eve morning arrived quietly. The plantation looked almost peaceful under the pale light. I helped Ruth dress. Esther braided her hair. I watched their hands. I stored the image away. I didn't tell myself it was the last time. I just told myself to remember it clearly. At the big house, everything unfolded as expected. Guests arrived in the afternoon. Coats were taken. Laughter echoed down halls that had heard screams before. The smell of roasting meat filled the air. I moved among them, invisible as ever. At 6 o'clock, I went to the cellar. The bottles were exactly where Miriam said they would be. I worked quickly but carefully. I replaced corks smoothly. No spills, no signs. When I carried the bottles upstairs, my hands were steady. Not because I felt confident, because I felt finished with hesitation. Thomas bumped into me near the stairs. He was already drunk. He told me to watch where I was going. I said yes, sir. He laughed and walked away. I watched him go and felt nothing. Dinner began at 7. Master Gray stood and spoke about blessings, about family, about prosperity. He didn't mention the people standing behind the walls holding trays. They raised their glasses. They drank. I watched. By 8, the first signs appeared. Small ones. A dropped fork. A hand on a chair back. Confused looks. By 8:15, I saw Esther at the kitchen door. Our eyes met. I nodded. She left. That moment passed quickly. Too quickly to feel like goodbye. At 8:30, the room was unraveling. Thomas stood and shouted. Master Gray tried to calm him and nearly fell. The Havsham daughters cried. Reverend Blackwood prayed aloud. His words tangled. I walked away from the wall and toward the study. No one stopped me. They were too busy trying to understand what was happening to themselves. In the study, I took the pistols. They were heavier than I remembered. Solid, real. I returned to the dining room. Thomas saw me and called me a name. He said I would hang. He said I was nothing. I shot him. I didn't aim for drawer. I aimed to stop him. He fell. Margaret screamed. Master Gray begged. He said he would fix it. He said he would free them. I told him it was too late. I told him he had already made his choice. I shot him. After that, I did not stop. Not because I was lost in rage, but because stopping would have meant leaving the work unfinished. I moved through the room methodically. When it was over, I stood alone among bodies and silence. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel relief. I felt empty and tired. I went to the study and sat at the desk. I wrote everything down, not because I thought it would save me, because I wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside my head. When the patrol arrived, I didn't run. I told them I did it. I told them why. They beat me until I couldn't stand. I didn't fight back. Fighting back then would have changed nothing. I had already done what I came to do. The rest was waiting. By the time Esther and Ruth left the cabin that night, I had stopped thinking in sentences. My thoughts came in pieces: time, distance, sound, light, what could be seen, what could not. That was all. I walked them part of the way, far enough to know they were moving cleanly, not far enough to be noticed missing. Ruth held Esther's hand. She didn't cry. That scared me more than if she had. Children cry when something is wrong but familiar. Silence means they know something has changed and don't know how to name it. When we reached the point where the trees thickened and the path narrowed, Jacob was already there with the horses. He didn't greet us. He didn't look at me for long. He helped Esther onto the saddle and lifted Ruth up behind her. Esther looked at me once, just once, no words, no promises. If we had spoken, it would have broken something we needed intact. I stepped back. Jacob nodded. Then they were gone. The sound of hooves faded quickly, swallowed by trees and distance. I stood there longer than I should have. I had to force myself to turn around. Standing still does not make people safer. Movement does. When I walked back toward the plantation, the night felt to open. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. I kept my pace even. Running attracts attention. Fear does not excuse mistakes. When I reached the quarters, no one stopped me. No one asked questions. Lights were low. People were inside, waiting. Everyone waits in different ways. I waited by working. I cleaned what needed cleaning. I checked doors. I touched objects I would not touch again. I did not sleep. There was no point. I sat and listened, whined, wood shifting. A distant owl. Nothing else. I did not imagine Esther riding north. I did not imagine Ruth growing up. Imagination is dangerous when you are still inside the moment that can kill you. Dawn came slow and pale. Christmas Eve. The day felt heavy from the start. The plantation looked clean. Too clean, as if the land itself had been scrubbed for inspection. At the big house, everything moved faster. Guests were expected early. Mrs. Gray was already irritated. She corrected small things sharply. She noticed dust no one else would see. I moved where I was told. I answered when spoken to. I did not linger. Inside, I counted hours. Every task became part of the countdown. By midday, carriages began arriving. Laughter carried across the yard. Voices sounded light. People greeted each other warmly. I stood near the door and took coats. I smiled when required. Smiling is easy when it does not mean anything. Thomas was already drinking. He slapped backs. He laughed aloud. He nearly knocked over a small table and cursed when it scraped the floor. No one corrected him. No one ever did. Master Gray watched him with irritation and pride mixed together. I noticed that. I always notice things like that. By late afternoon, the house smelled of food and smoke and spice. The kitchen was busy. Miriam worked steadily. Her face was tight. She did not look at me unless she had to. When she did, it was brief, enough to confirm we were both still holding to what we had chosen. I went to the cellar at 6, carrying the excuse I had been given. The cellar was cool and quiet. The bottles were lined neatly. I worked fast but not hurried. I removed corks. I added powder. I resealed them. I wiped the necks clean. I checked them twice. Mistakes happen when people rush. I did not rush. When I finished, I stood there for a moment, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just my breathing. I remember thinking that this was the last quiet moment I would have for a long time. When I carried the bottles upstairs, my hands were steady. I did not tell myself this meant I was strong. It only meant my body was doing what it had been trained to do. Thomas almost ran into me near the stairs. He smelled like whiskey and sweat. He told me to watch where I was going. He laughed when he said it. I lowered my eyes and stepped aside. He did not see me. He never had. That was the mistake he would not live long enough to understand. Dinner was announced at 7. The guests took their seats. I stood where I always stood, against the wall, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be ignored. Master Gray stood and spoke. He talked about blessings, about family, about prosperity, about labor. He did not use the word slave. He never did when guests were present. They raised their glasses. They drank. I watched each person take the first swallow, then the second, then another. I poured more wine. I refilled glasses. No one refused. By the time the first course was cleared, I could already see small changes. A pause where there should not have been one. A hand resting too long on the table. A blink that took effort. I said nothing. I kept moving. By 8, the signs were clearer. William Gray dropped his fork and laughed at it like it was a joke. One of the Havisham daughters complained that the room was spinning. Reverend Blackwood prayed under his breath. Thomas stood up suddenly and had to grab his chair to stay upright. Master Gray told him to sit down. His own voice sounded wrong, thin, uncertain. At 8:15, I saw Esther in the doorway near the kitchen. She was carrying a tray. Our eyes met. I gave the smallest nod I could manage. She did not hesitate. She set the tray down and walked away. No one noticed. They were too busy noticing themselves. That moment did not feel dramatic. It felt precise. After that, there was no reason to wait. At 8:30, the room was no longer holding together. People stood and sat and spoke without finishing sentences. Chairs scraped. Someone retched. Margaret Gray cried out for help. Master Gray tried to stand and nearly fell. He grabbed the table. I stepped away from the wall and walked toward the study. No one stopped me. I doubt anyone noticed. In the study, the air felt stale, familiar. I went straight to the desk. I retrieved the key. I opened the drawer. The pistols were there, exactly where they always were. I took them. I checked them, loaded, ready. They were heavier than they looked, real. When I returned to the dining room, Thomas saw me first. He shouted. He called me names. He told me I would hang. His words slurred together. He tried to come toward me and stumbled. I did not wait for him to finish. I raised the pistol and shot him. He fell backward. Blood spread across his shirt. Margaret screamed. She crawled toward him. Master Gray stared at me, like he was trying to understand what language it was speaking. He asked what I had done. I told him what he had made necessary. He begged. He said he would fix it. He said he would free them. He said anything that came into his head. I listened long enough to know he believed his own words in that moment. Belief did not matter anymore. I told him it was too late. I told him he had already chosen. I shot him. After that, I did not pause. I did not speak unless necessary. I moved through the room and finished it, one by one. I did not rush. I did not linger. When it was over, the room was quiet except for breathing that would soon stop. I stood there for a moment and felt nothing. No triumph, no horror, just a deep tiredness. I thought about Esther riding north. I thought about Ruth sleeping against her back. I hoped they were already far enough away. I went to the study and sat down. I found paper and ink. My hands shook then, not from fear, but from the release of effort. I wrote everything down. The sale, the list, the names, the reasons. I wrote so there would be no doubt. I signed my name, Solomon Gray. When I heard the horses and the shouting, I did not hide. I stayed where I was. When they burst in, guns raised, they looked at me like I was something impossible. I told them I did it. I told them why. They beat me until I could not stand. I did not fight back. There was nothing left to fight for in that room. The only thing that mattered was already on the road north. After they took me outside, after the blows stopped and I could breathe again, I was left alone for a short while. Not long, just long enough for my head to clear. My body hurt, but pain was familiar. Pain had never been the thing that scared me. What scared me was the waiting. I sat on the floor and listened to the sounds of the house changing. Doors opening, boots moving fast, voices raised, orders being shouted. I knew the plantation well enough to picture where everyone was without seeing them. I knew which paths the patrol would take. I knew how quickly news would travel. I measured time again, but now the measure was different. Not minutes until Esther reached safety. Minutes until someone decided to make an example. I thought about Jacob. I hoped he had not been seen. I hoped no one had followed the horses. Hope is dangerous at that stage, but the mind goes there anyway. I forced myself to stop imagining. Imagination after action only leads to regret, and regret would not help anyone. I thought instead about what I had done and what I had not done. I had not run. I had not hidden. That mattered. If I had tried to escape, the punishment would spread outward. This way, everything would collapse inward onto me. I held on to that logic because it was the only thing that made sense of the course. When they came back for me, they dragged me through the house. I saw the dining room again. The bodies had not been moved. Blood had spread further. Candles had burned low. The room smelled wrong, not just of death, of something spoiled that could not be cleaned away. I watched their faces as they looked at what had happened. Some were angry, some were afraid. None of them understood how a man like me had done this. That was clear. They kept asking how. They never asked why. Outside, the night air hit me hard. I looked up once and saw the sky. Clear, cold. I thought about Ruth seeing stars like that on the road north. I hoped she was asleep by then. I hoped she would never remember my face the way it looked at that moment. When they put chains on me, the weight felt familiar. I had lived under weight my whole life. This was only the shape changing. As they loaded me onto a cart, someone spat near my feet. Someone else crossed himself. I did not look at them. Looking invites conversation. Conversation invites mistakes. I stayed silent. The road away from the plantation was rough. The wheels creaked. Each sound felt final in its own way. I wondered briefly if this was what my mother had heard when they took her south. If she had looked at the same sky and made the same calculations about survival. That thought did not bring comfort. It brought clarity. I understood then that what I had done would not fix anything beyond my own family. Slavery would continue. The plantation system would survive me. I was not ending anything. I was interrupting it. That interruption was enough. It had to be. When we reached the holding cell beneath the courthouse, they threw me inside and locked the door. The stone was cold. The air was damp. I sat with my back against the wall and waited. Waiting again. That was always the shape of my life. But this time, the waiting felt different. Lighter in a way. Heavier in another. I did not wonder what would happen to me. I knew. I wondered instead whether Esther would reach the next safe place by dawn. Whether Ruth would ask questions. Whether Jacob would keep moving or stop to rest. These were questions without answers. I let them sit without trying to solve them. Solving was over. The night stretched on. Somewhere above me, people argued about what to do next. I could hear boots. I could hear keys. I could hear the sound of order trying to reassert itself. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, just to rest them. In the dark, I repeated one thing to myself, over and over. They are gone. They are moving. That had to be enough to carry me through whatever came next. I walked back into the dining room with the pistols in my hands, and I saw the exact second the room understood I was no longer furniture. That recognition moved across their faces faster than any prayer. It wasn't bravery on my part. It was just the moment their habits failed them. Thomas was on his feet, swaying, one hand on the chair back like he could steady his own body through wood. He tried to laugh and couldn't. His mouth opened and closed like he was searching for the right tone to put me back where he wanted me. He called me boy first. That was his reflex. Then he called me devil. That was his fear talking. He tried to step forward, and his knee buckled. He recovered with a stumble and his eyes fixed on the pistols. He understood what they were because he had held them before. He had threatened people with them before. He had pointed them at men who were tied down and called it discipline. Now the pistols were pointed the other way, and he did not know what to do with that. Master Gray was half standing, gripping the edge of the table with both hands. His face was pale. He looked older than I had ever seen him. Margaret was crying. One of the Havsham girls had her head on the table like she was sick. Reverend Blackwood was murmuring words that didn't fit together. Everything was out of order, and they hated that more than they hated me. Thomas tried to speak again. His voice cracked. He threatened me with the law, with God, with his father's name. Like names alone could stop a bullet. He told me I was nothing. That line was familiar. I had heard it in different forms for years. I didn't answer. Answering makes it a conversation. I wasn't there to negotiate. I raised the pistol and shot him. I didn't aim to make a point. I aimed to end movement. He went down hard. There was a sound when he hit the floor that didn't match the way he had always carried himself. It was small, human. Margaret screamed and crawled toward him, hands slipping in blood. Not understanding that her hands couldn't put him back together. Someone shouted my name. Solomon. Not boy. Not property. My name. It sounded wrong coming from their mouths. Master Gray stared at Thomas on the floor and then at me, like his mind couldn't hold both images at once. Then he started talking fast, saying words he had never said to me before. He said he could fix it. He said it was a mistake. He said Thomas had been drinking, as if whiskey had written the sales list, as if whiskey had decided that my wife and child were a profit problem to solve. He said he would call it off. He said Esther and Ruth would stay. He said it like he was giving a gift. I remember that clearly. He thought he was offering me mercy. He didn't understand that mercy given by the man who created the danger is not mercy. It is control. He tried to reach toward me, not with love, with bargaining. His hands shook. I could see the poison working in him. His mouth kept moving, but his eyes couldn't focus. He said he would free them. He said he would free me. He said he would write papers. He said he would do it tonight. He tried to make his voice sound like authority again. It failed. The authority was bleeding out of him, not from any wound, but from the fact that for the first time in his life his words were not enough. I told him it was too late. I said it plainly, not as a speech, just as a fact. He blinked hard, like he couldn't accept that time had passed beyond his control. He said I didn't have to do this. He said there would be consequences. I told him there had already been consequences for 23 years. Then I shot him. He fell forward, hands sliding off the table, knocking over a candle. Wax spilled. The candle rolled and sputtered. Someone tried to stand and collapsed. The room became a mess of bodies that didn't obey the people inside them. The poison had done what it needed to do. It had made them slow and confused. It had taken away their ability to act together. That was the whole point. If I had walked into that room without it, they would have rushed me. There were too many of them. They had guards. They had strength. But now they were separate, each in their own failing body. I moved through the room and I finished it. That sounds cold when I say it. It was cold. It had to be. I didn't stop to look at faces for too long. Looking too long turns people into individuals, and individuals can make you hesitate. Hesitation gets you killed. I had already decided that my life was not the thing I was saving. I was saving Esther and Ruth. That required me to be fast and final. I remember Reverend Blackwood trying to speak and not being able to form the words, like God had left his mouth first. I remember one of the guests reaching for a glass of water and missing it, fingers closing on nothing. I remember Margaret screaming my name again and again until her voice broke. I didn't answer her either. There was no answer that would matter. When the last movement in the room slowed into stillness, the noise stopped. The quiet afterward wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet you get when everything that used to be normal has been removed and the world hasn't decided what it is yet. I stood there with the pistol still in my hands and waited for myself to feel something dramatic. Triumph, horror, relief. I didn't get any of it. I felt tired. That's the truth. A tiredness that went deeper than my muscles. I thought about the road north. I thought about the stables. I thought about whether Jacob had already crossed the first creek. I thought about Ruth's head on Esther's shoulder. Those thoughts were not comforting. They were sharp. They kept me upright. I walked out of the dining room and into the study, because the study was where Master Gray kept his version of the truth. His papers, his records, his neat handwriting that turned lives into lines. I sat at his desk. The chair felt wrong under me. I had stood behind that chair 1,000 times and never once sat in it. Sitting in it now didn't feel like victory. It felt like borrowing something that would be taken back immediately. I opened the drawer and pulled out blank paper and ink. My hands started shaking then, not from fear of being caught, but from the release of holding myself steady for so long. Once the main work was done, my body remembered it was human. I dipped the pen and I wrote. I wrote the facts first, the date, Christmas Eve, 1854, Gray Plantation, Virginia. I wrote Master Gray's name. I wrote Thomas Gray's name. I wrote Esther's name. I wrote Ruth's name. I wrote that Thomas brought a list to the breakfast table and spoke about selling my wife and child after Christmas to a beer in New Orleans. I wrote that Master Gray approved it. I wrote that they spoke about them like livestock. I wrote it in plain language because plain language is harder to twist. I wrote that I did what I did to prevent the sale. I wrote that no one forced my hand except the men who owned it. I wrote that I was Solomon Gray and I was a man. I signed my name at the bottom, not because a signature makes you free, but because I wanted my own name on my own act. I wanted it documented the way they documented everything else. I wanted it so no one could later say it was an accident or a thief or an outsider or a rumor. I wanted it pinned to the right place. While I wrote, I could hear the house beginning to wake up outside that dining room. Not physically, socially, the staff moving in panic, someone screaming, someone running, doors slamming, a bell ringing. I didn't hide the paper. I set it on the desk where Master Gray would have set a deed. I put the pen down carefully. Then I stood and waited. I didn't try to run. That was another decision, just as important as the others. If I ran, they would hunt. They would unleash dogs. They would drag men out of cabins and beat them to get information. They would blame Jacob. They would blame Miriam. They would blame whoever they could reach. If I stayed, if I made myself the center, the punishment would be drawn toward me. That was my last protection. I knew they might still punish others anyway. White men punish out of fear, not justice. But I could reduce the reasons. I could make it simple. I did it. No one else. When the first armed men burst into the study, their eyes went wide, not because of the desk or the paper, but because I was standing there, alive, calm. They expected a monster. They expected a crazed man with wild eyes. They saw a servant standing straight. That confused them. Confusion makes men violent. They raised guns at me. They shouted. One of them asked where the others were. I told him to look. Another demanded to know who helped me. I said no one. He hit me with the butt of his gun hard enough that my teeth cut my lip. I tasted blood. I stayed on my feet. He hit me again. I fell to one knee. They grabbed my arms and dragged me out. In the hall, the smell of food was still there, mixed now with something metallic and wrong. They pushed me toward the dining room. I saw it again. The table still set, the candles low, the bodies sprawled in places that looked careless because death makes people look careless. One of the men gagged. Another cursed. Someone started praying loudly, not for the dead, for himself. They kept shouting questions at me. How did you do it? How did you get the guns? Where are the others? I repeated the same answer because repeating is safer than improvising. I did it. No one else. I did it because they were selling my wife and child. They didn't want to hear that. They wanted a different story. One where I was not human. One where my reason didn't exist. Because if my reason existed, then their world had a crack in it. They dragged me outside. The cold air hit me hard. The yard was full of movement now. Lanterns, men running, horses being saddled, dogs barking. I looked toward the stables without turning my head too much. I didn't see Jacob. That was good. Not seeing him meant he was gone or hidden. A deputy from the county arrived not long after, breath steaming, coat half buttoned, eyes trying to take in what had happened. He looked at me like I was a puzzle that offended him. He asked Master Gray's overseer what happened. The overseer said I went mad. That was his instinct. Madness is easier than truth. I spoke up and said no. I said I did it because they planned to sell my wife and child. The deputy stared at me. He asked if it was true. The overseer hesitated. That hesitation told the deputy more than any answer. The deputy looked away like he didn't want to carry the thought. Then he ordered me chained. They put iron on my wrists and ankles. The weight was familiar, just a different form of the same ownership I had lived under. They put me on a cart and drove me away from the plantation toward Richmond. The road was rough. Every bump sent pain through my ribs where someone had kicked me. I didn't count the bumps. I counted miles, not because I had any plan to escape, but because counting gave my mind something to hold. At some point, one of the men riding beside the cart asked me if I felt proud. He asked it like he was baiting me, like he wanted me to say yes, so he could feel righteous about what he was going to do to me. I told him I didn't feel proud. I told him I felt done. He didn't understand that either. He spat and turned away. When we reached the holding cell beneath the courthouse, they threw me inside. Stone walls, damp air, a smell of old sweat and fear. The door shut and the sound of the lock settling into place felt final. I sat down with my back against the wall. My wrists hurt from the cuffs. My mouth hurt from the cuts. My head throbbed. But underneath all of that, there was a strange quiet. Not peace, quiet. The kind of quiet you get when the main decision is behind you and all that remains is consequence. Above me, I could hear voices. Men arguing, papers being moved, boots pacing, the machinery of the state waking up to protect property. I did not expect fairness. I did not expect a trial that treated me like a man. I had seen enough of law to know it bends toward whoever owns land. I thought about Esther again. I tried to picture where she would be by then. I stopped myself. I focused instead on one practical thing: silence. If they questioned me, I would repeat the same story. Sale list, New Orleans, after Christmas, wife, child. I would not mention Jacob. I would not mention Miriam. I would not mention anything that could be used against someone else. If they offered me bargains, I would not take them. Bargains with men like that are traps. Hours passed. At some point, a minister came to the cell. Not Reverend Blackwood. Another one. He asked me if I repented. He asked me if I feared hell. I told him I feared living long enough to watch my daughter sold south. He tried to tell me God had a plan. I told him I had already seen the plan men like Master Gray followed, and if God approved it, then God could judge me himself. The minister left quickly. Later, the deputy returned with 2 other men. They carried my written statement from Master Gray's desk. I recognized my own handwriting. The deputy asked if I wrote it. I said yes. He asked if anyone forced me. I said no. He asked if I understood what would happen to me. I said yes. He asked again about accomplices. I said no. He hit me once, hard, like he thought pain would produce a better story. It didn't. I gave the same answer. Eventually he stopped, because even he could tell there was nothing else coming out of me. When the cell door closed again, I sat in the dark and repeated the same sentence in my head. Not like prayer, like a grip on a rope. They are gone. They are moving. They are not here. I held on to that because it was the only thing that mattered now. Everything else, trial, rope, grave, was already decided by people who never needed my permission. They didn't give me much time to sit with what I had done. The law moves fast when property is damaged. And to them that dining room was full of damaged property. I was taken upstairs the next morning and put in front of a judge, whose face told me the verdict before he opened his mouth. He didn't ask me to explain. He didn't ask me what led to it. He read charges like they were weights he was stacking, one on top of another: murder, insurrection, destruction of property. I noticed he said property last, like it mattered most. When they asked if I had anything to say in my defense, it wasn't a real question, it was a formality. I said what I had already written, that Thomas Gray brought a list to the breakfast table, that Master Gray approved the sale of my wife and child to New Orleans after Christmas, that I acted to stop it. The judge didn't interrupt me, but he didn't listen either. He looked past me, already finished. The sentence came quickly: hanging, public. 3 days later, not for justice, for instruction. They wanted people to see what happens when someone like me refuses to stay in place. I was taken back to the cell beneath the courthouse. The chains stayed on. My body hurt constantly now. Bruises darkened. Cuts swelled. Pain came in waves and then dulled. Pain has its own rhythm. You learn to live inside it. What hurt more was what I learned later that day. A guard mentioned it casually, like he was talking about whether Jacob had been taken, Miriam too, old Samuel as well. They were accused of knowing, accused of looking away, accused of not stopping me. None of that was true in the way the law pretends truth matters. They were sold south within days. That knowledge sat heavier than the chains. I had tried to draw the punishment inward, onto myself. I had failed. That is one of the things people don't like to hear about resistance. It always spills. It always takes more than it promises. I sat in the dark and thought about Jacob leading the horses north. I thought about Miriam's hands working dough in the kitchen. I thought about old Samuel humming his tune. I understood then that my act did not free anyone except my own family. And even that freedom came at a cost paid by others. There is no clean resistance inside a system built to punish everyone. I had to accept that or go mad. I accepted it. The first night passed slowly. I slept in pieces. The second day, a minister came, a younger man, not the one who had preached obedience from Master Gray's pulpit. He spoke softly. He asked if I wanted to pray. I told him no. He asked if I feared death. I told him I had feared living my whole life. Death was simpler. He asked if I repented. I told him I would do the same thing again if given the same choice. He left without arguing. That surprised me. Maybe he understood more than he wanted to admit. That night, I thought about my mother, about the day they took her, about the way her voice sounded when she told me to remember who I was, even if everything around me told me otherwise. I thought about Esther and Ruth. I didn't try to picture their faces clearly. I didn't want to fix them in one image and let time move on without me. I told myself only that they were alive, that they were moving, that they were somewhere beyond reach. That had to be enough. On the third day, they came for me at dawn. They pulled me from the cell and loaded me onto a cart. The streets were already lined with people, white faces mostly, curious, angry, afraid. They had come to watch order reassert itself, to see the system prove it was still stronger than any one man. I saw some darker faces too, standing back, watching carefully. Slaves brought in from surrounding areas on purpose. This was a lesson meant for them. I looked at those faces when I could. I didn't smile. I didn't shout. I just held their eyes long enough for them to see that I was standing straight. That mattered. The gallows stood in the center of the square, rough wood, reused many times. I climbed the steps with help because my legs were weak from the chains and the beatings. The judge read the sentence again. His voice sounded bored, routine. When he asked if I had last words, the crowd quieted. I hadn't planned a speech. Speeches are for people who think words can change outcomes. But I understood that silence could be misread. They would say I had nothing to say because I was ashamed or broken. I wasn't, so I spoke plainly. I said my name, Solomon Gray. I said I had been born free and taken. I said I had lived as property. I said I killed my masters because they planned to sell my wife and child and had already sold my mother. I said I was not sorry. I said I did what any man would do to protect his family. I told them to remember that, not me, that fact, that we feel pain and love and fear the same way they do, that actions have consequences, even when the law pretends otherwise. I didn't shout. I didn't curse them. I didn't ask for mercy. I stopped talking when there was nothing left that mattered. The executioner put the rope around my neck. It was rough against my skin. He asked if I was ready. I didn't answer. The floor dropped. There was a moment of falling, a moment where the world narrowed to sensation, and then nothing. This is where my story ends in the way stories usually do. But it didn't end everywhere. Esther and Ruth reached the north. I know that because someone told me before the end, quietly, like it was contraband. They reached Canada. Esther lived many years. Ruth grew up. She named her first son Solomon, not after a hero, after a man who made one decision when there were no good choices left. The grey plantation was sold months later. Slaves were scattered. The land moved on. It always does. There is no marker for me in Richmond, no stone, no record beyond a charge and a sentence. That is how the system prefers it. Names erased, reasons forgotten. But stories don't need permission to survive. They pass quietly, from mouth to mouth, from parent to child. This is not a story about revenge. It is not a warning meant to scare. It is a record of what happens when a man is pushed past the point where obedience makes sense. I was Solomon Gray. I was treated as property. I acted as a man. That is all.